Hi everybody and welcome back to Murder at Bedtime with me, your host Lyndon. This is a no frills, waffle free 10 to 20 minute true crime bedtime story. No ads, no sponsors, you don't even have to buy me a coffee. And with that, plump up your pillows, pull up your duvet and let's get into today's horrible case. Now, please remember this podcast is not suitable for children or for those triggered by extreme violence. And with that, let's crack on. John Hayes had had a very busy day, accumulating and counting his money at his pawnbrokers cum money lending business set within the much more acceptable coal merchants he owned on Tyburn Road, London. So lucrative were his business interests that the once farmer and carpenter from Worcestershire was now well off enough to basically be almost retired at the grand old age of 34. He was almost living the dream, if not for one thing, his wife Catherine. She was without doubt a handsome woman, but she was a nag. She fell out with all of their neighbours and she spent money as fast as he could earn it. These irked neighbours couldn't wait to tell John on his return from trips out of town how Catherine and her son from another relationship, 18-year-old Thomas Billings, who was lodging with them, were living it up with non-stop partying when he was absent. Things had come to a head recently when Catherine had demanded John double her allowance. His reaction to this was to halve her money. Annie gave her a good couple of hefty slaps to remind her who actually was in charge in this house. Feeling thoroughly pleased with himself, he decided a good drink was now in order, and so, as was his usual habit, locked up the business and made his way to the nearest alehouse. When he arrived, he found his wife and stepson already making merry, and he had joined them at their table. Shortly after, they were joined by another lodger, a friend of John's from Worcestershire, Thomas Wood. They got into a conversation, and at some point of the evening, the men decided on a drinking competition back at the house, where John bet he could drink 6 bottles of wine without getting drunk, and if he managed to stay sober, he would pay for all the wine himself. But John, unwittingly, had fallen into his wife's trap and didn't realise this was all part of Catherine's plan that she had already shared with the two lodgers some days before. And they decided tonight was the night they were going to carry it out. They went and bought the wine and went home, whereupon John, of course, got very, very drunk. The two lodgers kindly helped him up to his bedroom and he collapsed onto the bed, half on, half off, face up. After a short while, Catherine gave the word and Billings entered the room and hit John a mighty blow on the head with an axe, causing a terrible wound and fracture in his skull. But it wasn't a fatal blow, and his horrific screams and stamping on the floor were heard by a lady called Mrs. Springett, who rented the rooms above, and she came down to investigate. Catherine apologised for the disturbance, stating they were having a bit of a party. Back in the bedroom, Thomas Wood, John's very good friend from Worcestershire, took the axe from Billings, who had frozen to the spot, and continued attacking him with it until John laid dead on the bed, blood everywhere, the room resembling a slaughterhouse. But now they had a problem: what to do with the body. Catherine decided the best thing to do would be to cut off John's head, boil it in a pan on the stove to remove all the skin off it and dispose of the skull. Her thinking being that without a head the body could not be identified, and without a face, if the head was found, it would be unrecognisable. But unfortunately for them all, it would turn out this would be their undoing, as the other two convinced her against this, as it would take too long and the smell would have been way too ghastly. So Thomas Wood cut off John's head with his pocket knife, wrapped it in a rag, stuck it in a bucket, and under cover of darkness took it down to Westminster and threw it in the Thames, where unfortunately for them three, it landed on a sandbank. They then returned to the house, where they tried to box up the body, but the box they got was too small. So Thomas Wood, once again, dismembered the body into 5 manageable pieces, and he and Billings took the parts and threw them into a pond in Marylebone Fields. Mission accomplished. But why had they committed this crime? Well, that was all down to Catherine. She had tired of her husband. He was mean and aggressive and had beaten her on many occasions. Also, apparently, as I already may have mentioned, Catherine had a very large sexual appetite, which John could not satisfy, and both the lodgers had allegedly become her lovers. Yes, one of them being her 18-year-old son and the other being a great friend of the victim. Now, instead of running away with one or the other, she decided she just wanted rid of John. So she told her 2 lovers of her plan. Now, whether they agreed because she threatened to withdraw her sexual favours or it was for money she promised them, or both, isn't clear. But she also told Thomas Wood that her husband had murdered 2 of their children. Whether this is true is unlikely, but whatever the reason, they agreed to it. Catherine even supplying the money for them to drink at the alehouse. So what do we know about Catherine Hayes? Well, she was born Catherine Hall near Birmingham in 1690. There isn't much information about her until she reaches the age of 15, when she runs away from home and takes up with a group of army officers in Great Bardsley, Worcestershire. There she serviced all their needs until they tired of her and kicked her out. For the next few years she apparently alternated between working as a servant and as a prostitute. In 1713, Catherine, now 23 years old, found work as a servant at a farm owned by a Mr. Hayes, who had 3 sons. She soon set her sights on the eldest son, John, and with her ample charms and her apparently huge sexual appetite, she soon had him under her spell. Now, John's father did not approve of the match, but after the couple married in secret, he relented and gave them a cottage on the farm and a generous allowance. Now, just a little side thing here. On the night of their wedding, Catherine got her army friends to kidnap John and hold him captive for the night, telling him he was being forcefully conscripted into the army. They let him go in the morning, frightened and confused, and his wedding night totally ruined. Why? Well, apparently for a bit of a laugh. And if reports are true, Catherine had a couple of soldiers for company all night too. But this could be just a myth. I just thought, yeah, let's stick that in. For 6 months the marriage seemed okay, but Catherine soon became bored with farm life and needed more excitement, as John was struggling to keep up in the bedroom department after a hard day at work and not being able to keep up with her insatiable sexual appetite. That must be the 4th time I've said that, I apologise. Even then, it would seem Catherine was taking extra lovers. She also nagged him constantly to move to London, and eventually in 1719 he relented. He opened his coal merchants in the city, and money-wise life was good. But home life was not. And by 1725 the couple had completely fallen out of love, if indeed they were ever in it. So where were we? Oh yes, John's head was stuck on a sandbank and was found the next morning by a boatman. Now, there was no identikit or photography in those days, so what did they do to try and identify the victim? Well, they gave the head a good wash. Then they stuck it on the end of a wooden spike on general display in St Margaret's Churchyard, Westminster, where they encouraged thousands of people to visit the graveyard and carefully view the ghastly exhibit. And guess what? It worked a treat. Maybe it's something they ought to consider bringing back. And it makes the refusal of the two men not to boil all the skin off the head first, which was Catherine's idea, much more poignant. At least 3 people identified the head as maybe being John Hayes and visited Catherine to ask about him. 2 of them believed her story that he was away on business, so it couldn't be his head. But one, a Mr. Ashby, a business associate of John's that had supposed to have been having a meeting with him, did not believe the story or the one she came up with next, that John had in fact killed a man in a fight and had sailed away to Australia to avoid capture. Mr. Ashby went to the authorities, returning some time later with several constables. They made entry to the house, where they found Catherine and her son Thomas Billings in bed together, and they weren't just sleeping tops and tails. They were arrested along with neighbour Mrs. Springate. Thomas Wood had left the city straight after the murder, but returned a few days later and was also arrested. It was very soon apparent that Mrs. Springate had absolutely nothing to do with the murder and was released. At the coroner's inquest in April 1726, Catherine, along with Thomas Billing, were named as prime suspects. One of the highlights of the inquest was when the pickled head of John Hayes was brought into the room in a jar and put in front of Catherine. She was urged to open the jar and touch John's head, as a superstition of the time was that if a murderer touched the head of his victim, their guilt would be revealed. Now, I'm not sure if it would be revealed by the murderer or the head, but it's amazing that this should be allowed in a place of law. Did Catherine touch it? Of course she did. She couldn't get that lid off the jar fast enough. In fact, the head was removed from the jar for her, and she made a big song and dance about repeatedly kissing the face and caressing the head while sobbing, "Oh, my poor dear husband," because, of course, she knew she wasn't the actual murderer. The grief-stricken Widow Act would be in vain, though, as the weak link would turn out to be Thomas Wood. When he was questioned after being arrested, he very quickly unburdened himself. He confessed to the dismemberment only, though, and basically threw Catherine and Billing under the bus, saying she was the mastermind behind it all and Billing administered the fatal blows with the axe. This is probably not entirely true, and as I have said earlier in the story, Thomas Wood probably dealt the final blows, cut off Hayes' head and disposed of and dismembered his body parts. Catherine Hayes, Thomas Billings and Thomas Wood came to trial on the 20th to the 23rd of April 1726. Billing and Wood were charged with murder, but Catherine was charged with an even worse crime, that of petty treason. And this is one that I'm sure will get any lady listeners out there very angry. In the 18th century, men were considered much more valuable than women. So if a woman killed her husband, this was the equivalent of the murder of a master by a servant. Billings and Wood confessed to their crimes and were sentenced to be hanged and then to be gibbeted. That means their dead bodies to be hanged in chains until they rotted, very near to the place where the body was found. Catherine, who stuck to her defence that the devil had taken over them, was found guilty of petty treason and sentenced to be burned at the stake. Only 2 of the convicted murderers went to Tyburn for their executions on the 9th of May 1726. Thomas Wood dying in prison at Newgate of jail fever and so escaping the noose. Thomas Billings was hanged, then taken to a place near the pond in Marylebone where the victim's remains were found, and there his body was hanged in chains. Catherine Hayes was taken on a hurdle, a kind of sled pulled by a horse, to her place of execution, where she was chained to a post with a rope inserted through it and round her throat so the executioner could strangle her, which was customary before the flames consumed her. Then the faggots surrounding her were lit. As the flames reached her, the executioner pulled on the rope, but the wind blew the flames towards his hand, burning them and making him let go of the rope. Catherine's screams were terrible as the flames reached her, and she was seen trying to kick the burning faggots away. It is said that people threw large logs at her head to try to put her out of her misery, and one hit her and dashed her brains out. Let's hope for mercy's sake that was true. Just a little extra piece of info before the execution: because the crowd expected to attend was so huge, a makeshift platform was erected for a better view. This became so overcrowded that it collapsed, killing at least 4 people and injuring many others. Petty treason was abolished in England and Wales in 1828 and became plain murder. So a rather gory murder and horrible way to be executed. I think the way this story is reported puts Catherine in a really bad light. But we know nothing about her childhood or why she was so promiscuous at such an early age. Her sexual appetite is hearsay, as is the reporting of Billings being her son. Some reports I have read even saying that Billings' father was actually also John's father, which meant Billings actually killed his own brother. Which opens up a whole new can of worms. But I doubt that. There also seems to be a lot of evidence that John Hayes was a mean and violent man who beat Catherine badly on many occasions, and this hardly gets a mention anywhere. I think in this day and age she would have been charged with conspiracy to murder, and most probably, because of the violent way it was committed, would have received about a 20-year sentence, perhaps being out in about 15 for good behaviour. What do you think? Drop me a line on my Instagram page. So that is the end of the story, and thank you so much for listening. If you have found it of some interest, if you could give it a like and maybe subscribe to the channel and ding the little bell for further notifications, that would be fantastic. It really does help to get the episodes out there. Right, I haven't waffled for a while, so here we go. Thank you to everyone who took a look at my Exiled Yellowbelly YouTube channel, where I did a walk through all of the sites of my last episode on here, The Terrible Murder of Annie Leeson. If you haven't seen it, please pop on there and have a look. Recently, I went on a short holiday to North Yorkshire, where I went to the amazing Burton Agnes Hall and did a video for Halloween about the screaming skull of Burton Agnes, which will also be out on the Exiled Yellowbelly YouTube channel on Halloween evening. Now, anyone who watches this channel regularly and has heard about Trev, my friend. Trev is my friend, but also he is an anti-fan. He listens to all my episodes as they help him sleep because apparently of my boring voice. Well, he's fine now, but Reggie, his dog, was quite ill recently and we were all very worried for him. But he is over it now and is fine. I'm meeting my daughter Keita on Sunday. We haven't seen each other for some time, so a lot to catch up on. Anyway, that's it for me now. Hopefully I will see you next time. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch me and take care.